You guys probably know this, but the GH6 I think is an incredible camera. It's also incredibly confusing to a lot of people, so today I'm trying to look into fixing that. I'm going to test a ton of claims about the GH6, specifically regarding its ISO and dynamic range boost feature, which I've heard claims on various corners of the internet. Some seem plausible and reflect my experience, and some are just like wrong, incorrect. We gotta test these things because you can never be sure until you test it yourself, or you trust me to do a pretty good test, at least the best I can do. All right, guys, bear with me. We are gonna be testing a ton of claims about the GH6, specifically about its ISO and DR boost feature. They're pretty much, linked in my opinion. We're testing dynamic range boost in photos. We're testing ISO performance at different modes. We're looking at a ton of stuff here, so let's just jump right into it. But before we do that, a few things I want to clear up before. First, I'm not the most technical guy ever, so if you notice anything that's incorrect or that I should have done differently or could have done better, let me know in the comments, please. I'm typically more of a real-world testing type of guy, so this is my attempt to do a controlled setting. Also, I want everyone to keep in mind that it's important to know the technical aspects and, optimal settings for your camera. It's really a minor thing in the grand scheme of filmmaking, and while you, for certain situations, definitely should and will want to use these ideal settings, it's important to keep these technical aspects in mind, but it's not the only thing that matters. It's really just a tiny aspect of filmmaking compared to everything else you should be considering. So while this might be interesting, informative, educational, try not to overthink this stuff too much depending on the situation. So let's clarify some terms here that I'm going to be using and that's generally used talking about this kind of stuff. And that's going to be based on my own understanding, as well as Panasonic's own wording about the subject of base versus native ISO. So base is agreed upon to be the lowest ISO your camera can go. There's some extended ISO modes that allow you to go even lower, but we'll talk about that later. The native ISO is oftentimes with Panasonic the same as the base ISO, but it's always different based on the different cameras and manufacturers and models. Panasonic tends to try and have these things line up, so the native ISO is typically the lowest ISO in each current mode, which is the key. So except for like the GH5S, which is some weirdo freak enigma, we don't know what's going on there, but we tried. If you want to check that out, link. So for example, things like the dual gain sensor of the S1H or the DR boost on the GH6 are considered like modes with one or the other. So on the S1H, you can set high or low circuit for the gains. Those lowest values in each mode are considered both native ISOs at 640 and 4000 in Vlog. But the 4000 is not considered a base ISO because technically you can go way lower than that. So using all this info, let's clarify once and for all the base, native, whatever ISOs of the GH6 while we're on the subject. The GH6 works in the same way with its DR boost feature being turned off and on. The dynamic range boost off in the standard profiles, the ISO is base 100 and Vlog is 250. Those are both base ISOs of the camera, and if you enable DR boost, it's limited to 800 minimum and 2000 minimum in standard and Vlog, which means that the values of 800 and 2000 are considered the second native ISO of the camera. So for the best results, shoot in 100 DR boost off, 800 DR boost on in standard modes, and 250 and 2000 in Vlog with DR boost off and on as well. Any variation up and down from those settings will have some kind of drawbacks from the image, usually pretty minor, but as you stray further from the native ISOs, it gets a little more rough, as you'll see. Here's a quick bonus on how to figure out what your native ISOs are in any given mode on most Panasonic cameras. So you'll see we're at 250 ISO and we're about 0.2 stops over. That's the base ISO or native ISO. If you switch over to DB, you can see that it's a lot overexposed at first, but if you set it to 0 decibels, you've got the exact same reading on your spot meter. So 0 decibels is going to be the native ISO in any given mode. So if we switch back to ISO and enable dynamic range boost, for example, let's get that stops back down to about 0.2 over. And again, if you go 2000 ISO, switch it back to decibels, you can see that 0 in this mode now is native to the dynamic range boost, which means 2000 is also 0 decibels in this situation. There, now you never have to wonder if you're using the optimal ISO ever again, and I especially recommend GH5S users do this because a lot of people are really wrong about the ISO in that camera. So something I wondered right away when the GH6 was announced or when it was leaked was if this fancy new dynamic range boost worked or benefited me at all when working in the standard picture profiles. And by standard, I mean anything from standard to natural to NAD, basically anything but Vlog at HLG. So to test dynamic range, I would simply increase my shutter speed up and down to gradually over or underexpose my images. And to me, at first, it seemed basically identical at 100 versus 800 ISO. When I took a closer look, you actually do get slightly nicer roll off in the highlights, a little bit more information. But in most situations, when it comes to recovering information or avoid highlight clipping out, I can't really give the exact measurement, but it seems like less than 1/3 to me. It's kind of hard to measure this stuff without an actual lab setting and without spending tons and tons of time. But generally, yes, there is some benefit to dynamic range boost in standard profiles, but I think most people would be hard pressed to see it in most situations. So while you do get the tiniest boost in dynamic range, I wanted to test and see if the standard modes, there was any trade-off in like the noise or color department. And don't worry, we'll be testing all that with Vlog later. So looking at the classic black lens cap test, you can see it kind of looks like ISO 100 and ISO 800 DR boost turned off look the noisiest, and 800 DR boost turned on is the cleanest. So next I brought out a test chart and underexposed it by just a bit to bring up the shadows to show you guys the noise a little bit better. And look at this, ISO 100 looks pretty good, very detailed image. ISO 800 is not bad, but you can tell that there's been some serious noise reduction applied, and the details are just a little bit smudged out here on these little textures. You turn DR boost on, and I think those textures are a little more detailed and the noise is a little bit better, but honestly, for the most detailed images, the lower ISO, at least in the natural picture profile, looks just a bit better in overall. But I think second best is dynamic range boost turned on at 800 ISO. So it looks like 100 is probably the best. You do get the tiniest bit of dynamic range out of 800 DR boost on, but it's like a third of a stop, maybe less, which is not much at all. It's kind of disappointing. I wanted like a real true HDR effect. You're just not gonna quite get that, unfortunately. But we do know that 800 is better with DR boost on than it is with off. So if you're at 100, good, great, clean images, sharp images. But if you get to even like 400, I would really consider just boosting up to 800 because you're gonna get that dynamic range boost. But 800 is better than 400, 640, 800 with dynamic range boost off. And I got some kind of official word from Panasonic that dynamic range boost in the standard picture profiles, or in fact anything outside of Vlog, the main goal is to improve the shadows and the noise in the shadows. But in Vlog, it's to give you extra highlight information. So that's an interesting point right there. In Vlog, you're getting extra highlight information, but in the other profiles, you're getting better shadows. So very interesting development there. So there has been much talk about the noise performance of the GH6 in every possible way in combination, but I was curious to see how the noise would perform myself. I've seen a few people claim that 2000 ISO DR boost was the cleanest image on the camera. I've seen people say DR boost isn't worth it because it introduces way too much noise and they never use it. And honestly, I have even made that claim myself based on anecdotal evidence and just looking at footage without testing it. So I did this test twice just to make sure. First, we did the classic lens cap technique to see how the pure blacks performed. Increase that contrast, zoom in a ton, and we can see that the 2000 ISO looks really good. Like, I'm not sure if it's just me, but they're both totally fine. Don't get me wrong, I don't know, but I actually am thinking, based on just this test, the 2000 looks cleaner. It's going to be hard to tell with YouTube compression, which is why I do all these little tricks to make it more visible to you guys. But what do you guys think? 250 versus 2000 DR boost. Honestly, using just the black screen lens cap test, I'm going to say the 2000 is better, but just barely, and they're both really, really good. Pulling out the old color chart kind of shows us a different story though. If we underexpose 250 and 2000, you can kind of see that the 250, in my opinion, looks a little bit better, both on the chart and in some of this wood on the background at the frame of the window. Going to -2 stops, it's kind of the same story, but when you go to -3 stops and then boost it up, it actually looks like the 2000 dynamic range boost is a little bit better somehow. So is dynamic range boost noisier? Well, yes is the short answer, but it's complicated, okay? So if you look at slightly underexposed images or the middle dark areas, then the DR boost off seems to perform a little bit better when it comes to noise, but DR boost on at 2000 doesn't perform poorly. It is a little bit noisier, but I think the noise looks natural enough, and it's very fine, film grainy type noise a lot of the times, unless you really are underexposed. And speaking of really underexposed, if you're in a kind of silhouette sort of situation with really dark shadows, I think those really dark darks are actually better at 2000 than they are at 250. So does the image appear noisier at face value? Yes, but the super dark shadows are better. And there's also little factors like you can overexpose by another 2/3 or full stop with DR boost on because of the extra highlight roll-off information, and that might also lead to even cleaner images. So another complicated issue, but if you expose exactly the same for 250 and 2000 DR boost on, then the 250 is going to be cleaner with the other downsides that we talked about. And quick bonus, 2000 DR boost off is a lot worse than 2000 DR boost on. So honestly, if you're ever getting to 800 ISO, really I would avoid 1000 to 1600 range with DR boost off and just skip up to 2000 DR boost on if you can. And speaking of that, this is something else I've seen a fair bit of claims online about, is the GH6 secretly has a dual gain sensor, and the short answer is no. The long answer is also no, but it's kind of complicated. So as we talked about, yes, the GH6 does perform very similar 250 versus 2000 with the air boost on when it comes to noise, low light, all that stuff, but just not as clearly as what I think a dedicated dual gain sensor like the S5 would do, where there's a very noticeable reset from 32 to 4000, and everything from 64 up and 4000 up is just gradually gets worse. The GH6 is a lot more complicated. It doesn't perform poorly, but after ISO 2000, it's not really that good. And while people will claim yeah, I can see a noise reduction going from, 1600 to 2000, even with DR boost off, well, there's actually multiple stages of that, and it is just that noise reduction inside the camera. It's built in to some level, even turned all the way down. So yeah, while I can think, some people will claim there's a dual gain sensor in this camera, I haven't heard anyone claim that there's a triple or quadruple gain sensor, and that's how many times a stop or two of noise reduction kicks in the camera. Even shooting ProRes 5.7K, there's still those stops of noise reduction in there, and I think that's what people are seeing. Camera's pretty good in low light. 2000 ISO is definitely better than 2000 ISO with the DR boost turned off, but it's just not a dual gain sensor. So yes, the dual gain output sensor in the GH6 does kind of behave like a classic dual gain sensor, but it isn't one. It's fundamentally different. Plus, dual gain sensors are all the rage right now. Panasonic invented them pretty much, I think, or at least popularized them. So if it had one in there, don't you think Panasonic would, advertise it to have that ability? So we've been looking at the high and low native ISOs for a while, so let's switch gears to the super low ISO values and see if there's any point in using that extended low ISO on this camera. Well, be warned, you will lose a bit or quite a bit of highlight information depending on the mode, but essentially the camera's gonna be able to go for photos and standard video from 100 to 50 instead at the low, and in Vlog from 250 to 100. But why would you do this? Well, in theory, you can get a somewhat cleaner images, and the tests I've run seem to support that. The ideal situation for this is probably a studio setting where you've got everything like perfectly dialed in and lit well, but you really just don't need your camera to rely on that huge dynamic range. You just want the cleanest image possible. But realistically, I see a lot of people using this when it's like way too bright out and you want to shoot with the fast lens and your ND is not strong enough or non-existent. Then it's not ideal because if you're like in a park, the leaves in the background are going to look terrible with the white sky. But in a pinch, you will get low noise, the lowest noise these cameras can put out, honestly. And the highlight roll off most. So using the low ISO values, definitely confirmed with a few caveats. Like everything, it's not that easy. Yes, if you're in a studio environment or an emergency situation, using those low ISO values can be helpful and actually can be ideal, but in general, for everyday shooting, I don't think the trade-off is worth it. So there's been a lot of talk about the GH5 actually outperforming the GH6 at lower ISO values. And right away, there definitely seems to be some truth to that. They look pretty similar, although the GH5 is a little smudgier, which implies noise reduction to me, but the GH6 isn't exactly leagues ahead of the GH5 at the low ISOs, but it's those high ISOs that really start to see it run away. And definitely take note that the dynamic range boost seems to be doing a lot here as well. The noise from the GH6 from an aesthetic perspective doesn't have as many colors. It's a little bit more neutral and organic to me. This is super personal preference sort of stuff. Also keep in mind that the way that some of these places measure noise and measure dynamic range and things like that is going to be pretty different. And so someone might measure it one way, somebody else might measure it another way. And generally, I can pretty confidently say that the GH6 is about the same as the GH5 at those lower ISOs, if not a little bit better. But then the high range is way better. So just my 2 cents, but again, I would love to hear you guys' experience with the camera, especially those coming from the GH5 or the GH5 Mark II. Welcome, photographers, and thanks for sticking around. And if you didn't stick around, but actually just skipped ahead, well, that's fine too, I guess. But the question here is, does DR Boost work for photos with the GH6? Well, I've heard quite a few people talk about that, and Sean from Panasonic has also said that it automatically does kick in at 800 ISO, but he hasn't really said what it does exactly. So, I mean, and don't get me started, but why can't we have an automatic mode for DR Boost for video? I mean, it's on automatically all the time for photos, which means it's like going to give you the best results at those higher settings. So wouldn't you want that for the video too? Or like at least have the option, but that's a video for another day. So I did a similar overexposure test like I did with the video, but this time I shot RAW and JPEG for the base ISO of 100, and then the same test at 800, where the DR Boost should kick in again automatically, but only in photo mode. But I'm gonna try to drop it, okay? Let's pull up those RAWs. So if you're a JPEG shooter, you do get the tiniest bit better color, noise, DR, dynamic range, performance, whatever, but it being crunched down to that 8-bit JPEG really isn't doing you any benefits, or at least not as much as RAW. I just overexpose this image to, test this dynamic range in RAWs and see what could be brought back in terms of your highlight info, your color, things like that. I used mixed lighting even because I thought it would break the image a little bit faster. And as you can see, I think at every value, the 800 ISO has more highlight information, like probably a full stop, just like in video, which is crazy. I also think the color, even at the highest level of photo manipulation and overexposure that I could debatably get away with, I think that 800 ISO holds up better than 100 ISO in every aspect. Maybe 100 ISO is a little bit cleaner, just like the other dynamic range boost conversations with video, but 800 ISO definitely has more dynamic range and better color information and all that sort of stuff. So it is kind of confirmed, I suppose, that yeah, dynamic range boost does kick in automatically at 800 ISO, and it does give you better dynamic range and, in my opinion, better colors, or at least color recovery when you're recovering these highlights and shadows. But anyway, go do your own testing for sure, just like with all of this, but I thought this was a pretty fascinating find. Does this mean you should shoot at 800 ISO all the time for photography? I can't really say that, but hey, if you're in like a super high contrast situation, or you're like getting the sky and stuff's like super underexposed in the foreground, or you know, you're gonna have some clipping highlights you might not want to clip, yeah, try doing one version of each and seeing which one's better, or maybe just go up to 800 and, you know, accept a little bit more noise and do your thing. So yeah, let me know what you guys' thoughts are. Does anyone else do this? Does anyone shoot at exclusively 800 ISO? Let me know. I just want to have a little discussion here at the end about, is the GH6 just an inherently noisy camera? And like everything in this video, there's two sides of the coin. At lower ISOs, it performs decent. At the middle ISOs with dynamic range boost off, it performs kind of bad, or similarly to the GH5 or other contemporary cameras. And then at the higher ISOs above the dynamic range boost switch, with it off, but especially with it on, the ISO performance is actually pretty fantastic. Same with photos. I do feel like sometimes the photos are a little bit noisier than some other cameras I've used, but at the same time, if you set things to 800, you get a lot better results. And at the high ISOs, the detail it retains is actually really, really solid. So it's just an inconsistent camera if you don't know the ISO values you're working with, you know. The further away from ISO 100 you get, or ISO 250 in Vlog, the more I'm gonna recommend you just switch over to 800 or 2000 with dynamic range boost turned on. But even in those situations, you're gonna want to expose just a little to the right, or make sure you don't underexpose, because that's when I see people complain about noisy footage on the GH6 or even the S5, S5 II, the vast majority of the time something's happening. It's being really underexposed, it's being pixel peeped, it's being held under a microscope, or the grading isn't there when it comes to Vlog. And if you address some of those points, this camera can really work in your favor. These Panasonic cameras can really work in your favor, but they need light, they need good exposure. And I don't recommend exposing to the right much, especially not 2 full stops like some people say you should do, but definitely don't underexpose, because then you're in for a really bad time. So the GH6, it's a little noisier than I expected sometimes. It's a lot better than I expected other times, but generally, I think it's a very good performer, a very decent performer when it comes to noise. It's not amazing like the S5 II, S5 IIX, S5. It's not a legend like the GH5S, I don't think. Still need to test that, stay posted for a future video. But is it a noisy camera? I think there's just less noise reduction in this camera than a lot of cameras you're gonna find in the marketplace. Even the S5 II and S5 IIX have really strong noise reduction you can't turn off. And just like we talked about earlier, I'd rather have control of that in post. Yeah, let me know what you guys think. What is your experience with the noise on the GH6? Is it a noisy camera? Is it average or a little bit bad, but you can work around it with certain settings? Like, I wanna know what your experience is, because when I didn't know which ISO values performed better or worse and how to use this camera, there was situations where I would be disappointed in the noise performance, but then there was other situations where I was really impressed. And for a while, and even occasionally to this day, I wonder, like, how is this so noisy? Or like, even how does this look so good? And just using the camera in a lot of different circumstances, testing the camera like I've been doing, has really opened my eyes to that gap of ISOs that perform poorly. And looking at other people's posts have made me realize how much people underexpose and misgrade and mishandle the footage when it comes to post-production. And as a final gift to you, I will give you my biggest tip on ISO and noise, which is it can't hurt you if you don't let it. You know, you guys are pixel peeping like 400%, zooming in, looking at it on a 4K display, and then uploading it to Instagram in a 9:16 video. And that's fine, and it's good that you're considering and thinking about noise and grain, but I talk about low light shooting with the GH6, and I've shot a bunch of like club videos for my buddies at maximum 12,800, giga low light, even underexposed, and when you upload it to Instagram, it looks awesome. So the colors, the details, all that stuff holds up really great with the GH6, but to get those raw color information and details and make sure that stuff doesn't break and fall apart at those high ISOs, they've reduced that less in Vlog especially. And personally, I appreciate that, but your mileage and what you do may vary. And if you really have that big of an issue with noise, I do recommend going up to the full frame cameras. Even the S5 is incredible, and I don't think anyone would be harmed by having a GH5S in their bag as a B or C camera. I actually had quite a few more things to test, like, you know, noise in pixel to pixel mode, whether exposing to the right is always right, and the best way to expose Vlog, and a bunch of other things like niche things like that, but probably that's plenty enough for one video. If you want to see more GH6 myth busting testing around ISO, DR boost, or other things like crop factor and random stuff like that, I have a ton of ideas and I could always use more. So send me your comments, let me know if you have confusion, and we'll try to address it here on the channel in a couple follow-up Mythbuster type videos where we really go in depth on this thing. But anyway, guys, I appreciate you stopping by. If you watched to the end here, I know you enjoyed the video, so like the button, and if you like the button, hit the button. Comment, leave a comment, feed the algorithm, do whatever it takes to make sure that I have the motivation to do this channel still. No, nothing can dissuade my motivation. I'm here for the conversation. I'm gonna test this stuff anyway for my own benefit and my own, you know, reasons. So I'm just trying to share my results with you guys, and I appreciate you guys stopping by a lot, making this channel what it is. Without you guys, I wouldn't have even wanted to do this channel. It wouldn't be anything. So thank you guys for sticking with me and making this thing happen. I've got some lens reviews coming up next, but if you enjoyed this video, like I said, any interactions help a lot. And even if you don't interact, I appreciate the view. So thanks for stopping by. Leave a comment, start the discussion, keep the discussion going. Even if the video is a year old, we want people to have as much information and as all the information they want. So get out there, start shooting. Don't think about anything that's in this video too hard, but if you can keep it at the back of your head rattling around somewhere, maybe it'll help somebody sometime. Anyway, thanks again, guys. Have a good one.